So this video is going to be going over custom brushes. So in the end we'll be creating our own brush designs and exporting them in a certain file. But before we do that, we need to actually kind of look at what makes a brush in certain ways that we haven't before. So I'm going to switch back to just black and white color here. I'm going to go to a regular paintbrush and I'm going to select, you can tell I was working with special brushes. Here we go. Just a regular brush, and we've looked before at the size of the brush and hardness. Oop, there we go. Unfortunately, there's no way to get out of that without making a mark. But we can change the shape, the size, the hardness. We choose the shape from these over here, but these settings are also available over here if we click on this button and then go to this. So this palette is actually identical to this shortcut, but we need to work from this palette if we're going to be, saving brushes and things like that. And there was a point in class where we went over all of these other dynamics. We're not really going to go over them now, but you should know that these things can be saved to a brush. So for example, let's say you are always wanting to work with a particular kind of dry brush looking brush, right? So, oh dear, I don't know what's going on there. Go away. Not strong enough. So you choose the type of brush. We're going to go back to this one. And let's say there's other settings you want to add to it. So you want to add transfer dynamics, which change the amount. So you can see that there's light, dark, there's things like that. These are not things I actually use with a brush, but we're going to pretend. Let's say you have a brush where you add some noise. That looks awful. We're going to turn that texture off. But whatever it is that you're doing, let's say you've got this perfect brush, right? So you always want it to have these settings. And you're tired of always having to go back in and like, okay, I'm going to find this brush because you've done something else, let's say. I need to get back to this brush with all of these crazy settings, and you want it to be this particular size. And if you're working on this long enough, maybe that is a lot to do all the time. So what you can do is in this brushes panel, you can actually come right here and you can say create new brush. I'm going to call it just my brush one, and it'll actually create a new preset. It's based on this shape and all of the other settings that you have. You can capture the brush size if you want. Only do that if you actually do always want it to be that size, because what we're used to is the brush will stay the same size except just be different settings when we change them. Also, I've never used include color before, but you can tell it to include the rest of the tool settings, which is kind of the point. And so I say OK, and what that means is that it would help if I had opacity turned up. There we go. No matter what I'm doing, what other things I'm working on, I can eventually go down here and see, oh, my brush one. Oh, that's a different time I did it. It probably showed up. Yeah, there we go. My brush one. This is the one I did this time. And I can always get this setting back. And you can see other ones I've actually worked on and other ones I've imported from other people, which is something we'll get to in a minute. But all of your brushes that you save, they'll show up here. And oddly enough, they show up in the area that you had selected, which for me is too much. I don't like that. I'd rather have my brushes all in one area. I'm used to the top of this panel being a certain way. But you can move them around. These are not in any particular order, like permanently. You can change the order, and you can also add folders, or I call them groups basically. So my brushes. There we go. So I have this thing called my brushes, and I just drag the ones that are my brushes into that group. And once I do that, it puts them in here, and then I can twirl them up, right? These probably are ones I've made too at other times, so I'm going to put them in there. There we go. So I can have this group, and I can twirl it up, I can twirl it down. I can also put it up at the top if I want to, so I can move that wherever I need it to be to get to it. I'm used to being at the bottom though, so we're going to keep it there. And there we go. So this follows the same rules as like Illustrator layers, where you can, when you drag something up, it goes over it. But if you drag, these things sort of inside the folder, you'll see a highlight. You can make those changes. There we go. So, and you can see that we made a smiley face brush earlier. So now we have to find a way to start from scratch. You can see I've actually made one before for other demonstrations. It was a smiley face. And all of these other brushes, they have a shape to them, right? They don't, someone had to sit there and say, okay, make it look like this. Where's a good one? There we go. There it is. Someone designed that shape to make it look like a leaf, right? Someone designed that sponge look right there. Someone designed that. We're gonna have to turn all this nonsense off. There we go. All right, so someone had to design this pattern, and then they had to find a way to save it so that it was a brush, and that's the next step. That's what we want to go over. So I've got this 1000 by 1000 pixel thing here, and you can either start with a bitmap like this, or you can start with shapes in Illustrator. I have a couple I can show you that look like that. But whatever you start with, you need to draw what it is that you want to be the brush shape. Now for some of these, like a lot of these, they're just variations on a circle or on a swatch. There you go. Oh, I'm on eraser again. There we go. You see those little slash marks right there? So someone designed this brush to be just those little slashes, and I think there's a setting for them to shift around too and go in the direction that you're going. But you can start with something like that that's meant to be dragged. So these are brushes that you're meant to scroll around with, right? So many of these brushes are meant to be dragged and they create a particular pattern. There are some that are also more like stencils. We'll get to those in a second. But if you want to start with something that's meant to be a particularly round shape, you have this 1000 by 1000 box, and you can start by drawing whatever you think that shape is going to be. Maybe you want some sort of blobby shape. You want to get some sort of soft edge brush. And so I come in here and I turn down the hardness, and there we go. And I just start to kind of tinker with how I want this to look. Now, this is what the origin shape of the brush is going to be. It's not that it's going to draw the way we just drew, it's going to make this the shape. And I have to figure out what I want that shape to be, and you'll have to test to see how it works when you actually draw with it. One thing I forgot to mention, you really need this to be black on white. If you use any color that has more light in it than this corner right here, this dark bottom row, then the brush will never get lighter, or it will never get darker than wherever you were. So if you use anything that is lighter, see how this is half as dark as this this full black right here? All of these colors across this line, if I use red, it's half as dark as this, which means the brush can only ever be half as dark. It can only ever be 50% opacity, which you might want, but I don't. So in most cases, you really want to start with the black on white, and this is also a grayscale image. It doesn't matter if you have blue or red or green, that's not going to get saved. Only the grayscale part of the image is going to get saved. So you might as well stick with grayscale anyways. Alright, so I make this shape, and then I go up to Edit, Define Brush Preset. And when I do that, it's going to create a new brush, like a new shape for a new brush. And so I'm going to say blob brush. It makes a brush called blob brush, and it actually, look at that, it makes a brush based on the shape I just had. and that's how it draws, at least with the default settings. I can add whatever settings on top of this that I want, including, oh, because it has a hardness, so I can't change the hardness softness of this because that's built into the brush, right? So these ones that have hardness softness in it don't have that already built in, but if you make something that has those soft edges, that's what your edge is going to be. So it's a different way to think about things. There we go. I'm gonna turn this off. But that's my brush. So I kind of made this little blobby brush, and it's everything I hoped and dreamed for, maybe. The other thing you can do, if I go back up to a regular brush here, is make something that looks like a stencil, and that's where all those little smiley faces come in. So I've been making little smiley faces, and then when you do that, now I had to get rid of everything, by the way. There's nothing left here. You want to make sure you have a clean palette to work with. Edit, define brush preset, smiley 2. Alright, and now I have a brush that looks like the smiley face. Doesn't really make a good repeating pattern though. There's not as much utility for that. But there's nothing wrong with making a brush that is a stencil if it is something that you're going to use over and over and over again. And I have some examples of student work, not these, that are like that. So one good way to show off your brushes is to actually kind of make yourself a little bit of a palette and see how they look. So these are brushes, these were designed by a student, and you can see most of them, except for these two, but the other 4, they look more like stencils. This one does in fact make an interesting pattern, as does this sort of sparkly one here, but they also, you can see how they would work as a stamp, right? Whereas these two up at the top work more as brushes that you might drag around. This one is all texture, what I might call texture brushes, except maybe this purple one. So you can see they made brushes that can stack really nicely and be dragged around and create a texture. These are all stamps. So they're hand-drawn. They're not made in using like Illustrator or anything. Even this could have been using shapes in Photoshop. But you can see how it's not really going to make too much of a brush like for dragging. It's going to be a stamp. These are more stamps too. So most people have fun making stamp brushes and drawing those kinds of patterns. All right, so whatever it is you start out with, you can use different things. Now, when I was doing this in class, I actually made these shapes in Illustrator. And all I did was I made the shape and did like rotations or transform or something, and then I would just copy what that shape was and paste it into Photoshop, into a different document, and then I kind of made the brushes over here. And so these kind of work okay actually as a brush, as like a pattern too. It really won't look as a brush stroke, it works more like a pattern you create using this stamp tool. But these were procedurally made in Illustrator, just using a couple transform filters, and then I copy. You don't have to open something from Illustrator to get it into here. You don't have to export from Illustrator. You can just literally Control C copy and then bring it over into Photoshop and Control V paste. But what if I wanted to use these brushes, right? So we've been saving the brushes that I've just been doing here, but what if I wanted to save the ones I did in class? They don't travel with the file. I did not get any new brushes magically now that I opened this file. One thing to keep in mind is that any brushes you make are on your machine. They are not in the file. So all these brushes that I have saved here are saved in some crazy file folder somewhere that I don't know where it is. So how do we actually get them out of here in good fashion? So I said before that you can just select all of the, you can shift select all these, move them around. So we can do this, shift select, and then, so just to review, this button is to just make a new preset that goes in here. Define brush preset looks at the shape you have on hand and creates an entirely new brush. But if we want to save all these, we have to go to this menu up here, and then say export selected brushes. And by selected, it means what you have highlighted in here. Export selected brushes. And you can see I've been working on this before. We're going to go to, there we go. I've got a file name here, new brushes. It's a terrible file name. And it saves it as an ABR file. And an ABR file is useful literally only for this. You're not going to see this anywhere else. You're not going to open this anywhere else. This is a Photoshop thing. And you can see it says brushes. These are a lot like font files. If you've ever installed the typeface onto your computer, you have seen a file that says font. All right. This is brushes. And so if we want to use these brushes, we need to save them. This is the file. And it's a really small file. And then we need to import them. So you need to kind of export it as a file to keep with you on your flash drive at all times or in your Google Drive or wherever. So if I would like these brushes that I made during class, I need to then, because I saved them at class, so I need to go to the same menu and say import brushes. So we exported them earlier. Now I'm going to say import brushes. And brushes, these are the ones I believe I imported from class. Or exported at class, yes. Yes, spirals. Spirals is what I want. There we go. And so there's... Haha. Wondered why I was only seeing half of it. But these are the brushes I created during that class. Now you can see it makes an interesting pattern when I drag with it, but they're more stencils / stamps. But if you're going to spend that kind of time making a brush, you need to have a way to actually take it with you. And depending on what you're working on, you may need something to pull up over and over and over again. I'm thinking of that sparkly sky one that someone had that could easily be used to decorate something. I'm being very sloppy about where I put these things. But if I had guides, I could easily line them up on a grid a little bit better than what I just did there. They look like stamps and like something you use in Illustrator, like symbols. They are not. We can't align them. We can't select them as objects. This is just one sheet of paper, right? I'm just scribbling like I would with any other paintbrush. But they can still look pretty nice. And all I did was start with one circle in Illustrator and used to transform and then copied that over here and made it into a brush. All right, so now for those of you thinking, oh my gosh, that's so much to remember. Well, the good news is I have the instructions on making a custom brush under here. So if you go into the custom brushes folder, it gives you the step-by-step, create an image, in black only please. You can select the entire image. It turns out you maybe don't have to. I have that in there just in case, but I so far haven't had any problems with skipping that step. Edit, define brush preset, select a name to put the brush under, repeat this process for all your brushes, and then for the purposes of the homework, select all 6 select all 6 brushes in the brush palette, and then in the brush menu select export selected brushes, which is this part where you select multiple brushes, and you go up to this menu, say export. For the purposes of the homework assignment, which you're going to be making 6 individual new brushes, 6 custom brush designs, please, please, please put them all in one file, because for both my sake and yours in the future, we cannot import more than one file at a time. It's a very cruel joke. If I say import brushes, I cannot shift select. Photoshop is not having it. They're like, no, 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 one at a time. And when I go to look at your brushes, I really don't want to have to select 6 at a time. But also, if you in the future would like to use them, you don't want to have to do that either. So, all 6, one ABR file. Makes everything much, much easier. Let's see. Oh, one last thing that's in this folder is actually some examples. So these are not the same ones you see from me, but they are sets of brushes. So this is not one brush. This is a whole bunch of brushes, and they should, because they've been with this class for so long, you should be able to use them wherever you want. They're there for you to see, for you to try and import them. So you just click on them and download the file, and then you would go brush menu, import brushes, and I'm not going to do that because I already have them in here somewhere, way up here. I've imported a lot of brushes. Most things don't come with this many brushes. All right, but there will be a lot of Celtic stamps and stuff. And then keep in mind, you can use these shapes for anything that runs on a brush, which is the brush tool, the clone stamp tool, well, history brush, although it's, an eraser tool, burn and dodge, right? I would say regular brush, eraser, burn, and dodge are the ones where you're most likely to use them. I cannot imagine a reason to have this shape with the clone stamp tool, I'll be honest. It's not, there's no utility there. But for brush and eraser, definitely. And I would say eraser because if you reverse the colors, when we come down here, you can do an inverted stamp. Or you can just stamp with white, but depending on what you're working on, you may need it to be an eraser, right? So anything that runs on a brush shape or a brush mechanic can use these brushes that you're making. And you can take them with you possibly to any version of Photoshop. Certainly, they're pretty flexible. These should not have any problem going back a few versions. So you can make brushes at school and then bring them to wherever you end up. Whatever computer you end up on, if it has an older version of Photoshop, you should be able to import them. And one last thing, however big you make this is how big your brush can be before it starts getting fuzzy. So I have this brush here, and this is the same size as when I made it in class. So it's pretty much exactly as big as this page. Ugh. One of these days I'll remember. There we go. And so it can look pretty sharp at up to 100%. But like anything, if I try to make this bigger than that, you can already see it. Well, maybe you can't see, but I can see it got fuzzy. So there is a limit to the resolution on the brush. There we go. So I made the brush bigger than it had been made originally, and now it's got these fuzzy edges. So for the purposes of class, 1,000 by 1,000 pixels, more than appropriate. For your purposes in real life after this, if you need a stamp to be, if you need it to be bigger, you need to make the brush bigger. You need to make the physical space you're working in with Photoshop bigger, and then you will have that crispness rather than what we have here, which is awful. So if I bring this back down, you can see, by the way, when it gets to a certain size, it can't even preview it, which is interesting. There we go. I think this is the biggest it can go. Right? Just how much clearer that looks. It's going to be, I mean, if I zoom in, we can see the pixelation, but we can see it's just the amount of pixelation you would have to have a curved line in Photoshop. It's not like overly fuzzy. All right, so 1,000 by 1,000 pixels is a good place to start. There's going to be two things you hand in for this. There's going to be that ABR file that has all of your brushes, and also a palette. Nope, that's not a thing. Let me bring up those palettes again. Make them nice like this. Don't make them scribbly like mine was. Where you show the stamp and then you show what it looks like when you're dragging. And again, this could be like 1,000 by 1,000 or something. You just make the brush smaller. But we want to see both what it looks like as a stencil, like as an individual thing, and then how it drags around. And it just makes it easier for me to see what you've made. And see it all in one place. And you can make them all multiple colors like this, or you can just make them all the same color. It's whatever strikes your fancy. But try to be organized about it so that it's clear what's happening where.